Okay guys, so let's do this. I'm sorry if I look greasy or if my hair looks crazy. I went surfing this morning and I didn't take a shower, so that's just what happens. I'm a dude, I can deal with it. Hopefully you guys can deal with it. All right, so let's do this thing. Okay, so before we jump into the menus, I wanted to show you guys a couple things that I'm using with my X-T3 on a day-to-day basis. So here's some of the things that I'm using. Let's start with power. I feel like that's the Achilles heel to the Fuji system, is the actual battery life. But what's really great is you're able to charge the battery through a USB-C port, and using this anchor, let's show it again. Maybe one day, there we go. This thing is amazing. You're able to get up to 320 minutes of shooting time with this battery bank. And if you're using a monopod setup, a gimbal setup, or a tripod at any point, or you're doing interviews, having this power bank will seriously help you from having to change out batteries and just seriously smooth out your overall shooting day. This is also great too if you want to just power your batteries from this thing while you're shooting and you're doing more photo stuff. You can also do that too in your backpack. Keep it in your backpack, put the power bank on there with the batteries, and you can keep charging all day long. It's seriously awesome. Another thing that I use, and I'm too cheap to buy the video version, is the X-Rite color checker. I mostly use this for white balance correction or custom white balance in the Fuji to use custom white balances on both my cameras. But this is also great too later on in post. You can set this up for photo as well, and basically helping you get more true to lifelike colors per se. So this is a great thing to have for photo and video. I use it mostly for custom white balance, but you can also use it in the color settings as well. Some other things that are really important to me, and I think to all filmmakers, is audio equipment. I like using the Rode Link lav set. So these are what these guys look like. The other end is on my camera right now. I apologize, so I kept that out. I also use these for run and gun. It's just the Rode Mic Video, or the Rode Mic Video Plus. It's one of the Rode versions. I'll leave the link below so that you know what it is. And then a good set of headphones. So these aren't the greatest headphones in the world, so don't be like, oh, those aren't video headphones. They work, they help me monitor audio. Just get a good set of headphones, you'll be thankful for that. Also, I like to record externally. So I use this zoom here, and you like how I'm waiting for everything to come into focus before I start talking. It's great. But yeah, I use the Zoom H6. It's a great little device, and that's what I'm using. What's great about the H6 over the H5 is you have more basically lines of audio that you can record simultaneously, and then take those out into your audio editor, and through each track be able to edit the audio on each individual track. It's just great. If you're using the H5 gives you 4. So the H5, H6 is great because it separates those audio tracks. Obviously in audio, I would always carry around some kind of XLR cable. This is good to have, maybe 2. I've seen these go out, but XLR cables are really great to have. Okay, so moving on to stabilization. I know this is a giant rig. I'm holding this up. It looks like a beast. This is my monopod setup. It's just a Manfrotto monopod. And then I'm using the wooden camera rig on this thing. And I like the wooden camera stuff because it's so flexible with different cameras, and it's not limited to just one camera. You can kind of see it here. And yeah, I think it's just really, really great. One of the things that kind of bug me about camera cages is they're limited to one camera. So every time a new camera comes out, or if you move to a different camera, you have to buy a whole new rig, versus with the wooden camera setup, you can kind of modulate this rig to fit any camera. So again, for long-term purchasing, this is a great rig to have. So let's talk about lens accessories. First of all, I like to use ND filters, regular ones and variable. You can kind of see what it's doing there in the camera. Basically darkens your footage so that you can shoot at the appropriate frame rates. On top of using ND filters, I like to use these, basically these Tiffen black Pro Mist filters. And what these do is it enables basically the footage not to look so sharp or so digital. So I really, if I'm shooting Fuji lenses, it's rare that I won't have one of these black mist filters on my rig. So you can check that out also in the link below. I'll have those in the link so that you guys can get to those easily. I just dropped a monopod. It's gonna be okay though. All right, and then the variable ND, again, all this is doing is it's getting lighter and darker based upon the turn. You can kind of see that happening there. Sorry, this isn't the best way to use this, but you kind of get what's happening. So what this allows you to do is to really quickly change your exposure without going into the controls. One of the things I don't like about variable NDs on a lot of them is they cause color cast. The Tiffen ones, I actually feel like they do a really good job of controlling the color cast if you stay within the variable rates of that ND filter. Another lens accessory that's really important to me is a hood, and I love this bright tangerine hood system. It basically allows you to use drop-in ND filters and the Tiffen Black Pro Mist filters, just dropping them in front of the glass so you're not constantly screwing them on. This is great because you can adapt different size lenses to this opening, and you can also use cinema lenses in all different variations. So this hood system, it's small, it's compact, it's great for the kind of work that I do, and I love it. So those are my lens accessories. It's my audio accessories, kind of like my tripod setup or my monopod setup. I also use the DJI Ronin S. You guys have all seen that 100 times. It's great for just fluid motion and video. And so with that said, let's go into the menus. Okay guys, so first things first, if you notice at any point that my frame rates and my shutter speeds don't match up, and what I mean by that is if at some point my shutter speed isn't the appropriate shutter speed for shooting at the appropriate frame rate, then don't panic. I'm just gonna be changing settings quite a bit, so I might not always change that shutter speed to match the frame rate. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just a good general rule of thumb, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second or you're shooting at 24 or 30 or whatever the case may be, you want your shutter speed to be double that. So right now my shutter is at 48, which is double the actual frame rates of 24. This is just a good rule of thumb. If you're shooting at 30, you'd want your shutter to be set at 60. If you're shooting at 60 or 59.94, you'd want your shutter speed to be set at 120. So again, just double up that shutter speed. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can message me and I can give you some just some more insight on why we do this. What's great about the Fuji is it enables you to get closer to that true 180-degree shutter angle, which is what video or cinema cameras use. And we're basically using the shutter to mimic that, that setting. So what's great about the Fuji is you actually get a true 180-degree shutter speed or shutter angle versus like on a Sony, some of the Sony mirrorless cameras or the Canons, you're basically stuck like at 50 if you're shooting 24, so forth and so on. Okay, so let's go into the menu. We're gonna start off in the video menu. That's where we're pretty much gonna live this entire little tutorial. And it's just like that little clip art movie icon that you can see there. You're just gonna select into that, use the direction pad to get over into it. And in movie mode, I like to shoot in DCI 17.9. I love wide aspect ratios. I love the look of the bars. For the most part, I'll live here. And when I'm shooting any kind of interview or I'm shooting people, I love this 17.9, and if I can be, I'm gonna be in the H.265 or the 10-bit codec, which is internally 420, and if you can look in HDMI, you're gonna get that 422 out. But because we're going internally right now, you're gonna be dealing with 420. Now, there are some cases where I'm gonna wanna shoot in different frame rates, and you can't shoot every frame rate in DCI. So in order to shoot 4K, you're 60 frames, you're gonna have to go back out of here, change your codec to H.264, which is gonna give you an 8-bit internal. Don't freak out, you can go 10-bit out, but in order to shoot internal 4K 60, you're going back to the 8-bit. And then you're gonna go back into your you can't shoot DCI, but you can go into 4K 16.9, 200 megs, and that's how I would set up my 4K 60. You're limited in what you can do with DCI. Again, if I'm wanting to use some B-roll and I don't want that extreme slowdown, for the most part, I would shoot the DCI 30 frames a second. I'm totally good with that. I know a lot of people love super slow-mo stuff. If you watch my video before this video, I actually shot 30 frames quite a bit. And so it just smooths out the footage. It gives you a little bit of a slowdown without like an extreme, slowdown in your footage. And this enables you to actually still shoot H.265, which is great. So you can actually shoot H.265 30 frames a second, get full 10-bit in this mode. For the most part, if I'm shooting like interview stuff and I'm using B-roll, I would shoot the H.265 and the H.265 in DCI. But if I need to slow down or go to a different frame rate, I'm gonna have to go back down to H.264 and then change this over into 4K 16.9. Okay, so there's not a lot of times where I'm shooting HD anymore. I know that's crazy. You know, you guys are like, well, 4K is overkill. If I don't have to, I don't, unless I'm shooting the high frame rate, which we're gonna talk about in a second. But yep, for the most part, this would be my settings for 4K. So again, DCI, H.265, again, you just change in here, you would go into H.265, and then you're gonna go into your 30 frames at 400 megs, and this is just gonna give you just a really great, it's gonna give you a really great look and just the ability to just really have an aggressive color grade when you go back into post. So I love this. Okay, so we're still in menu number 1. I use all eye compression. Now the difference between these two, basically all eye is taking every frame. It's a bigger compression. It's basically taking every frame from the video. So if you're shooting 24 frames, it's gathering all 24 frames. Long op is basically looking at the pixels in a long story short, it's saying, hey, do I need to replace these pixels in every frame? And it's making up pixels as it goes. I know that's a really bad explanation. You can Google this, but I use all intra all the time. Unless, I will say, if I'm running out of card space, I might go to long op. All intra is a little bit harder, all intra can be harder on your computer as far as storage space, but long op actually has to interpret. So there's arguments for both and why you would or wouldn't use both. All right, so let's talk about full HD high-speed recording. Now, my preference for this is to shoot the 120 frames per second and then have it converted to 5994. Now, basically what this means is that you're still shooting 100 frames per second, but then Fuji is interpreting that footage down to basically 60 frames per second or 5994 instead of interpreting it down to 2398 or 24. Now the reason why I do this is a couple of reasons. Number one, I like to speed ramp in post or have the ability to speed ramp. And I find out if you're shooting in 60, the speed ramping is a lot more fluid or it looks nicer when I'm shooting in this 60 frames per second or when Fuji conforms it instead of conforming it all the way down to 24. Also, I find that when Fuji conforms it down to 24 frames per second versus doing it in post, it doesn't look as smooth. I feel like it looks smoother when I'm able to do that in DaVinci or in Premiere. So again, I like to do this because I like to have the full control over conforming the frame rate all the way down to 24 myself in post versus having Fuji do it. So again, I shoot at 120 frames per second and then having Fuji interpret or conform that footage to 59 instead of them having them conform it all the way down to 24. This could be a personal preference thing for you guys. If you don't know how to interpret footage or conform footage and you just want it to do it just quick, dirty, and easy, then shooting in the 24 frames, there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's in here for a reason. This is just my preference. I like to conform it later and do it myself. So whatever your preference is, or if you don't know how to do it, then shooting in 24 is fine. But the way that I shoot all my slow-mo in HD, I basically tell Fuji to conform it to 60 frames per second or 5994, and then I interpret it myself. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so let's go to film simulation. 99% of the time, guys, I'm using the Eterna Cinema profile. I love how flat it is, and it just looks good. It's great to work with in grading. And for 99% of the stuff that I do, this looks really good. Now, if you're wanting to shoot something more on the fly or you're not trying to color grade, Previa is great, Velvia is great. These are just great film simulations, and Classic Chrome honestly looks good too in recording. So if you're not doing any kind of color grading, these would be some defaults that I would use. Again, I would custom set these up and I'll show you what I'm talking about in a second. But 99% of the time, I use the Eterna Cinema footage in the videos that I've created with the XH1, the XT2, or sorry, the XH1, yeah, the XT2. They give us the profile update via FLog. And in the XT3, this is my go-to. I love it. Okay, so white balance. If I'm doing any kind of white balance, I don't use the icons, guys. I use a custom setup. I would get a white balance card, I would shoot it, and I would use that and match my cameras up. I don't ever, in any circumstances, honestly, just pick icon to let my white balance set to, and I don't use auto white balance. Now for you guys that don't have a card, they're really inexpensive. You can get one on Amazon, seriously, probably for $5. I'll put a link in the description, but it's something that I would get used to doing if you're not doing it, especially when you're talking about matching up multiple cameras. Okay, we're still in menu number 1, dynamic range. This, a lot of people get this just really confused and they just want the most dynamic range, so they automatically put everything to 400. And in F-Log, I understand that because you're trying to get the most out of your F-Log recording, and your ISO is going to be jumped up to 640, but you do have the option to actually bump back down to 200 as well, so that if it's really, really bright outside, you can shoot at a lower f-stop, or basically lower your exposure so you're not just blowing everything out. But for the most part, I like the 100 and 200 because it suits most of everything that I do. The 200, I live at the beach, at the coast in California, and 200, even on a bright day when there's really bright highlights and dark shadows, 200 in 10-bit, you know, honestly does a great job, even in 8-bit, because once you start pushing the shadows and highlights and, you know, you start kind of messing with the image, 400, to me, seems to fall apart. But again, if you're in a situation where you don't have the option and you need to retain the highlights and the shadows, then I understand using 400, but for the most part, I use 200 and 100. This is just basically giving you just more details in the shadows and highlights and just really contrasted scenes. But 200 for me seems to do the job, 100 in situations where I don't need it. Yep. All right, so menu 2. So earlier I talked about in menu 1, setting up your film simulations. So in menu 2, you're able to take better control of these. And this is basically what I would shoot when setting up the Eterna. I turn down my highlight tone -1. The shadow tone I leave at 0. If I'm shooting F-Log, I would bring this up to +1. The color I leave at -1 because I find, especially in the 10-bit internal, I could bring the color back really nicely and it looks great and I have more control there. And the sharpness, just because the Fuji lenses, I bring this down to -1. A lot of people say that it's not over sharpened, but to my eye it is. And so yeah, -1 is where I live. If I'm using basically any kind of cinema glass, I might bring it to 0, but I honestly, -1 is where I leave it most of the time. And I match my cameras up to that. I leave my sharpness at -1. If you need something to be really, really sharp, if you're shooting a product, if you're shooting something that requires it, then yeah, I would go back to 0, but I don't know if I'd go +1, +2. That's just up to you, that's up to taste, that's a preference thing. Noise reduction, I have to 0. Interframe NR, I don't want the camera taking any control of the noise reduction, I turn that off. F-Log recording, now this is where you would enable it. And again, you can basically come in here and turn down your sharpness and have control there. But for the most part, F-Log is F-Log, and you're not gonna be able to really control what you're doing in F-Log in terms of settings, unless you're using an external recorder, which I talked about a second ago. Okay, so this is how you would enable it. You turn it back off. Peripheral light correction. If I'm using the Fuji lenses, I found that this doesn't really make a big difference. I leave it on, and I know a lot of people would freak out and be like, well, you're basically telling the camera what to do. I get it. With the Fuji lenses, I'm good. If I'm using any kind of cinema glass, I turn it off. Okay, so let's go into page 3 of this. Now this is focus area, just shows you where your focusing points are. This is kind of funny that this is here, but okay. You don't really have to change anything. That's just telling you where you can and can't put your square. If you guys find that useful for any other reason, just let me know. Okay, going back to page 3, A of C custom settings. So the autofocus C settings in the front of the camera, you'll change this to C. This is where you're gonna get your custom settings. Now, track sensitivity. Now all this is, and what this means is if you have your square in the dead center of your camera or to the left or the right, and you're filming something and then something jumps in front of that thing that you're filming, this is basically asking you like how fast you want it to switch or how slow you want it to switch, or not switch basically at all to the thing walking in front of your camera. And so if something moves in front of your subject, on that square, it's gonna lock to that. So basically it's saying, hey, if something jumps in front of the sensor, AKA the square, how fast do you want it to move to that? And if you don't want it to move to that, you would go -4. Now, if you're like showing off product and you're talking about it and you hold it out in front of the camera, you might want to go to 1 or 0 to quickly have that transition and then go back to focusing on you or the square. But if you know that your subject is your subject and you don't want to move the focus point off that, then go into 3 or 4. 2 is just safe. The camera gives you 2. I leave this in 2 if I'm using any kind of autofocus and it seems to be fine. Now again, if I think something's gonna run in front of me, then I would put it on 3 or 4. Again, if I was showing off a product, I would move it to 1 maybe. Okay, so that's basically what that means. And then the AF speed is how fast it's racking that focus. For me, I want it to move slower. So I'm going to basically the -2 here because I don't want it to be very digital and rack focus. I want it to be very slow, more cinematic. That's my style. If you need it to be faster, then you would just go faster. So how fast it racks focus, not changing focus, but how fast it would rack focus. Again, -2 here. Then you would have MF assist. I like to use red for focus peaking. So if I'm using manual focus lenses, I like the red highlight to pop up. That's what I like. Focus check on and off. Basically, this gives you the ability to push in on focus. So if we were looking at these headphones and we need to see focus better, you can see that it's out of focus, but it would basically give you the ability to push in and push out here. And so I leave that on. I find it useful. Maybe if you want to save some battery life, you would turn it off, but I leave it on. Okay, and then these are just your output modes, basically 4K internal, 4K out, through HDMI. Same thing here, your HD, basically HD to the SD card, HD to HDMI as well. Okay, moving along, menu 4, here we go. So HDMI output display info. If you want to record or do a tutorial and you need to see your settings, or you're working with a DP or somebody that needs to see settings and you're not recording externally, but you just need to see settings, as I talked about, sometimes I'll use a Fill World monitor and I just want to look at settings on that monitor. You would turn it on. Because I'm doing a tutorial right now, it's on, but for the most part, when I'm out filming, this is off, okay? All right, so it's on now because I'm filming this tutorial so you guys can see my settings as I'm going, but for the most part, I would have this off. HDMI record control, I love this because if I'm using my Atomos Inferno, as soon as I hit record on the camera, then I'm able to also start recording without pressing a button a second time on the Atomos. So yes, I leave that on. Zebra settings, this is basically where you turn it on and off to basically for your focusing. Now it's very important here that you use left and not right. No, I'm just kidding. Whatever one's there, I use to just basically check exposure in a scene. Left seems to work fine. If you like it going right, that's up to you. Maybe there's a scientific reason for this. I don't know that. So for me, yeah, zebra left or right works. So this is where you would turn it on. And then how much you want displaying. For me, 60% is more than enough. Anything over that, it just really just distracts me. That's, again, a personal setting. Audio settings, this is where you would set up your internal mic, where everything would be set up. It's really basically your adjustment. If you have a mic that's hot, you would adjust it here. I always use manual. Your mic limiter, basically, so that you're not peaking. I leave that on. It works well when I'm recording internally. I really don't use the audio for internally all the time. I use an external audio device. So for me, this just is great for scratch audio. Wind filter off. I've used it on and off. I haven't really seen a great reduction. It kind of muffles the sound. I don't like it. The low cut filter and the headphones. So, okay, let's go back into the tally light and the time code. Time code settings, if I need to sync audio, I would use this with my external recorder, but because I'm externally recording, I don't really use the feature. Tally light, I guess it's nice to know when you're recording, but I don't use it quite that often. And movie silent controls in 5, I just don't like this. I don't like using the touchscreen. To be honest, I'm not a big touchscreen fan. I know that's gonna throw some of you guys off. I didn't buy this camera for the touchscreen, but if you want to use the touchscreen or you need to be quiet because these knobs are too loud, they're not, but if you need to have complete silence in a set or something, I guess. I've never been in a situation where my camera was too loud when changing the settings, so I'll just leave that at that. Okay, So that is basically how I would set my camera up in movie mode. One more thing that I want to talk about while we're still here is in my menu, you're able to actually create a My Menu, which is awesome. And I put the most important things that are like basically when I'm recording in this My Menu, so I can quickly get to them without having to go down to the movie icon, then scroll through the different menus and find out, you know, what's where. It's really easy to do, but this My Menu is a little bit faster. And the way that you would do that is you would go into the toolbar and you would go into user settings, and then you just go to my menu setting, and you can add items or remove items based upon what you want in there, what you don't want in there. So if I was doing this and I was like, okay, like these things are really great, and so most of the things I leave in here, but if you didn't need any of these things, then you could take them out. Or if you wanted to add items, you can add items from any menu. So again, this is all preference, the way that you like to work, what's important to you. For me, and let's just go into there. The only thing that I don't have in here would be zebras, but for me, I like to see my movie mode, the codec I'm using, that I can easily turn F-Log recording on and off, my film simulations, my high-speed recordings in here, my dynamic range setting, my output, and my audio settings. So for me, those are just really fast. Those are things that I'm changing really, really fast. If I need to go to zebra, I know where it's at, but I could easily add this into that menu and it could be a go. So depending on how you work, that's up to you. One more thing too, that's not in the My Menu, let's go into display back, is you notice I have my grids on. I love using those. So really quick, the way that you would turn on the grid is you would go into screen setup. This was tricky for me at first, to be honest. And then you're gonna go into framing guideline, which is on page 2, turn on grid 9. I like grid 9, that just gives you the general rule of thirds. And then you have to go into display custom settings and turn on frame guideline. If you, by default, this is off, and if you turn on the frame, the rule of thirds frame, basically the grid, you won't see it until you come into this display custom setting on page 1 and turn it on. Okay guys, if you have any questions or comments, leave those below and I'll help you out the most that I can. Again, this is the way that I set up my camera. If you want good results, this is just a good base layer. I'm constantly changing some of these things and tweaking these things. So this isn't the end all guide, like you must shoot like this. But this is where I would just, you know, this is where I live. This is what I like to do. And for 99% of the things that I do, this is where, yeah, this is how I would have my camera set up. So for you guys, turn off high speed, and I have all eye. So yeah, you have to use long op, by the way, instead of all intra and high frames rate, because I don't think the camera can keep up. So anyways, yeah, I hope that helped you. Again, if you have questions, make sure that you guys reach out, and I'm happy to basically walk you guys through your camera and help you guys set it up and get the best footage you basically can with your Fuji X-T3. I'm in love with this camera. I hope you guys are too. I hope that helps. All right. So this was a super long video, and if you've watched this to the end, that means you're just really pumped about your X-T3. Hopefully this video helps you get started with shooting better video with your X-T3 system. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments below. I'll answer them. As always, like and subscribe, and catch you guys next time.